like, stand up and do some jumping jacks with me. But every now and again, I'll throw something out there. And questions at any point are totally fair game. And if you're going down a rat hole, I'll pull you out of that. So if you've got a question and you see something, jump right in, okay? So let's start with the Mozilla story. The first thing, actually, let's start with this. Just by a quick show of hands, I imagine that most people's hands are going to go up on this, but how many of you are actually considering localization right now for content that you have? Okay, so there's some of you who aren't. How many of you are actually responsible for the localization of the content that you have? Okay, so we have some, what I'll call experts in the room, and you guys can jump in with any thoughts or comments about the stuff that we do. But let's go into the Mozilla story a little bit. We are a global community, and this isn't BS. There is actually this global community of volunteers out there who write the source code for Mozilla, who then take that source code for the Firefox product and the other products that we have and customize it for local use. Okay. People have asked me, is it really open source? Or you guys, you're Mozilla, you're making over $100 million a year. You hire people, you're not really an open source company. Not sure. We probably have about 300 employees worldwide, and by our best guess, somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50,000 volunteers. It's bigger than that. If you counted up our beta users who are actively testing our beta product, it's into the millions. And if you really wanted to get philosophical and you're using an open source product, then you're part of our community. I manage the localization process. So that community of people is working together to promote choice and innovation on the internet. Okay, so let's not spend too much on the Firefox itself, the product. I'm not really going to talk about Firefox 4 features. If you want to learn all about that, I'm happy to talk about it after this. If you have a dying question, I'll take it. But one thing I'll throw out here is, what is the big topic being debated this week inside the web browser space? H.264. In 24,000 characters or less, can you tell me what we're talking about?
So video codec.
Video codec.
It's supposed to be non-proprietary, but actually is.
Non-proprietary, but actually is. Does anyone know what he's talking about when we say video codec? So video gets put on the web, and these big platforms like Firefox have to ship things to decode that video. So you're watching a video on YouTube or whatever, your browser has to have something in there that can decode it, right? And most of the video on the web lives in Flash, but stuff can be encoded in a lot of things. H.264 is one of the encodings. And it was designed in the open, and you can read all these philosophical debates that are happening right now. But to give you an idea about openness and what we're talking about, platforms that ship something like an encoding that allows users to watch video has to pay a patent to the people who are the patent owners of H.264. So Mozilla, being free open source software, refused to pay that patent. We've never paid it. We're not going to pay millions of dollars to ship video to our users. We're not about that. Chrome announced 2 days ago that they're not doing the same thing. They're not doing it either. So now there's been this massive shift. Two of the leading browsers in the web that represent, or millions and millions of users use, representing probably somewhere between 30 and 40% of global market share, is not shipping H.264. But there's some big dogs in the fight that do support H.264, namely Apple and Microsoft. So this is the kind of stuff that we debate in this world of free, open source software. It gets very philosophical at the time, but rather than honing in terrifically on that, I want to move into sort of what exactly, this is not a good sign, but it's okay. I did my presentation on Keynote, and some of the formatting may be screwed up, so now I'll apologize in advance if some of these other slides are that way. But some of the things that Mozilla focuses on are Firefox, obviously, our mobile platform, services, and the open web. And the thing that I was just talking about with H.264, these codecs, that's what we're talking about when we say open web. And you'll hear that term being thrown around all the time. HTML5, CSS3, JavaScript, open web, H.264. That's the debate we're talking about. And Mozilla takes a very, very strong approach. It's a global community of people dedicated to free and open source software. Okay? Now, I personally manage the localization process. My official title is Director of Localization at Mozilla. We ship the Firefox browser across the world into as many languages as we can, and I manage that process, and we'll get into what I do. So we have roughly 25% market share. That number will differ. Global market share, 425 million users, offered in 80 plus languages. So let's take a look at some of the growth numbers. And what I'd like to show you here, this is 2010 growth numbers. You can see there's been massive growth. These are absolute numbers within regions, so they're not relative to each other. So 53% growth in Africa still represents a fairly small size in growth compared to other regions, because the web still hasn't penetrated in Africa. And what I'll try to do throughout this presentation is to really lay out the case, the strategic case for localization, and why it's much more than just sort of translating your content. But you can see where there's been tremendous growth. The gray one with the largest number represents what we call Oceania, and that would be like Indonesia, where we've seen massive growth, Malaysia, places like that, just tremendous amounts of growth. And I'll talk about why that's happening. This is last year's number. It's a terrible graph, but the numbers are similar, except in this one, we combined Oceania into Asia, so you see a much larger bar there. But for those graphs that you guys cannot read, this presentation will be on the web, so you're welcome to take anything here and send it anywhere you want. Now this graph is somewhat illustrative of where Firefox is. Every dot on this represents where we actually get at least one user agent request or ping for an update across the world. And it's really hard to do a graph like this because we're trying to also relay the size of the circle as it relates to our numbers of users. So if you're one user in the Maldives, you show up, and that circle still looks comparable to like the United States. But what we're trying to say here is that you can see where our concentrations of users and where the biggest circles are, but you can see that we're pretty much a global organization. So when we ship a browser, there are people all over the world using that technology, accessing that user interface, and getting our content. Another horrible graphic, so sorry for the size of this, but you can see at the very top, if you can't read it, you can see at the very top it shows our largest growth in users since September of 2008, Indonesia being incredibly huge. It has over 180% annual growth. So let me ask you one of the first questions. Why would you guys think that there would be this massive growth in Indonesia? This is starting to get into why localization is more than just translating strings. Why would people in Indonesia, why would be such massive growth? Anyone take a guess? Yes, in the back, please.
It's one of the most densely populated countries.
It's a very densely populated country, and the web is proliferating. So people are coming online. But that doesn't necessarily answer why are people using Firefox. And the reason is, and this is where we start to find out that like localization is critical, and this is what I learned from our lead Indian localizer. Word of mouth is so important in Indonesia. If a friend comes to me and says use Firefox, that is more valid to me than anything I can see on television, on the radio, or whatever. So if someone says use this, it takes off. So we have the localizer there who's been dedicated since day one, back in like 2004. And from him, from Rami, he's been sort of promoting Indonesian Firefox with another community of open source people. And we were a leading web browser before the web space was so competitive. And lo and behold, we're skyrocketing in Indonesia. We find this in a lot of countries. So really understanding what drives a product in the local market is critical, and you can do this through communities and localization. I think this is the graphic I was trying to refer to as horrible, because this lists all the countries across the world and their growth rates in blocks. Indonesia is the one at the top there with massive growth rate, but you're welcome to take a quicker look at that afterward. And of course, we release across mobile, so it's not just Firefox. If you're using an Android device, which, I don't know, I always see these differences in popularity in platforms, but you add up all the platforms out there, all the devices that are using Android, it's bigger than iPhone, so across smartphones, this is the biggest mobile operating system, and Firefox 4, as a full browser, can be used on a mobile device as well as on desktop. And so being able to use a browser in your local context on a device is critical. So we find we've invested a lot in that, and we have over 40 languages. for our mobile platform. So the other thing I talked about, of the 4 things we were talking about, the third one was services. And what do I mean by services? In the cloud, we offer Firefox sync, so you can sync between your Firefox product on your desktop and your mobile. That needs to be localized. From a security perspective, you can use a plugin check to see if all the plugins in your browser are up to date. That needs to be localized. There are design challenges, which Dees, who's my colleague in the front row up here, participates in. A design challenge has a lot more impact if you bring that to a global audience. Data, there's a test pilot program, open to the web. Other people want to use these things because it's open source. You can do that. That should be localized. And of course, our contact manager. The reason I bring all of this up is that if you want your product and your content to spread across the web, I think it makes a lot of sense to pitch to your product managers the need for something like localization. And I had to spend a lot of time at Mozilla kind of selling this to a lot of the developers, because for a long time, the perception at Mozilla was, we make strings, they go translate it. And the marketing department specifically was really, really, unaware of the importance of localization, as interesting as that might sound. And I'm not using that to sort of dig on Mozilla's marketing department, but I'm just saying that there was very much a North American context. We put it on the web, we put it in ENUS. If they can figure out how to translate it, fine, but that's Seth's job. But we had to spend a lot of time educating our content creators on what does transfer to a global marketplace. And the leading question I would always ask someone to try to convince them of their strategic content is, do you want this to be global? It wasn't, do you want it to be localized or translated? The first question I'd always ask is, do you intend this product to have a global audience? And anyone who was launching a product always said yes. Of course I want this to be global. I want millions I want 425 million users of this. And I would say, okay, if you want this to be global, let's figure out a proper content strategy. So let me lay out some of the industry landscape, if it's not already starting to become clear why we think there should be localization. You guys are welcome to use any of this stuff after the fact, because I think these are totally relevant. But the Next Web last week or the week before did a nice study where they ripped from Internet World Stats just a bunch of statistics about languages on the web. And English represents the largest number of users on the web with language as their primary language being English. So over 500 million people, 530 billion people on the web are using English. And that represents a 42% penetration of English speakers on the web. Second to them is Chinese. But I put this up here because you can see that if you're considering content, and a lot of people ask me this all the time, they say, where should we start? And you don't have to get 85 languages like Firefox, because I lead it and go, oh, we have 85 languages. Everyone goes, oh my God, how do I get 85? I need 5. If you get 10, you're going to get a lot of users, right? And if you come up with a good strategy on how to get those 10 and how to deploy that, you're going to get a lot of users using your content. So those top 10 languages represent 36% of the internet speaking population on the web. Now you can do, you can cross-tab this against where is your focus. If you know you have no business in Korea, and you never intend to do business in Korea, then take it off the list. Now you've got 9. Or find out what your languages are to get that number. So we found that, there's a tier. As much as anyone can participate in Mozilla, that's the whole point of open source. But if we found that we can get the top 10 languages out there, we're going to get a massive number of users of our content. And this, of course, is what the Next Web was trying to say, was that Chinese is the new dominant language of the web. I'm not sure I completely disagree with that, but you can see this tremendous growth. On the left side of the graph, on that circle, if you sort of put that on sort of a more linear scale, that just represents this hockey stick in growth of users of the past 10 years. So, back in the year 2000, it was at 23 million people on the web were speaking Chinese as a primary language. 10 years later, it's 420 million people. And of course, it's a standard Chinese paradigm. It's only going to get massively bigger. So Chinese is important. The reason I dispute this somewhat is that their penetration rate for users on the web is somewhere around 35%, as you saw on the graph before, 32%. English is still at 42%. So with almost 100 million more users on English, you only have a 10% differentiation. I think there's room for growth in both, but they're sort of declaring that Chinese is sort of the new dominant language on the web. Regardless, it's obviously critical. So let's focus a bit in Europe. There are 475 billion users of the web or the internet in Europe, and the rest of the world is 1.49 billion. I'm sorry, that should be million there, right? Yeah, sorry. No, that actually is 1.49 billion. That's right. Yeah, I'm sorry, but the rest of the world. Say again?
Put it down to the figures.
That's right. Europe is 475 billion people on the web. Million. You can use these figures. They're great. Totally reliable. I swear, it's because I did it in Keynote when it came onto PowerPoint. You know, it's just these words got changed. Somebody needed. And you can clearly see that I cut and pasted from the slide to the next one. I'll change this when I put it back. I'll tweet the real presentation online. Excuse me for these errors. 58% of Europe is on the web. That represents 475 million users. And you've got some room for growth here, another 338 million waiting. But that'll get bigger. You know, population grows. These are macroeconomic things that I think are worth looking at as you consider content strategy. So here's Europe. That's the world average. Somewhere below 30% of the world is actually on the internet, the world population. And the rest of the world is sort of below. So there is saturation in Europe. Now, what does that mean as content strategy or content strategists like ourselves? I think it means focus on Europe right now. If you want to get people using your content, get it into some European languages, and bam, you're going to get a lot of people. And don't forget places like obviously China and other places. Here's the saturation. So Germany leads the list with raw numbers of people on the web. Russia, UK. I showed this to some people yesterday, and they were surprised to see Turkey there. Turkey has a very healthy web, and a lot of people online, and a growing population, so it doesn't surprise me to see that number there. Italy just ahead of Spain, and I'm sure that really, busts Spain a lot to be right behind Italy, but maybe they'll sort it out. Poland's a very important place for us as well, but a lot of this stuff are absolute numbers, so the Netherlands is probably never going to get much bigger than that because the population is never going to grow to hundreds and hundreds of millions of people. Well, I guess in theory it will one day. So let's take a look at some global brands. Twitter, their international traffic accounts for 65% of their website's overall content. So growing in Europe and Asia. Facebook, staggeringly, has 517 million people using that website. So 26% of the web uses Facebook, which is mind-boggling. I mean, Firefox, it's impressive, right? That we have 450 million users using this product. The fact that people are dialing up this website every day to that level, I mean, 7.6% of the world's population is using Facebook. So that could be you guys, What it does represent, though, is that content is consumed, and some of the bigger brands that have a great user experience that people want, it goes global. And if you don't have this effective localization strategy, you'll never reach these numbers. So if I take a look at Facebook users in the world, Europe leading the mark there with 162 million people, and North America at 149 million numbers of Facebook users as of August 2010. And the Facebook index represents the number of people using Facebook compared to those on the web. So 56% of North Americans who are on the web are using Facebook. And Oceania, Australia is huge. But look at Europe, there's at 34%. So even though there are 160 million people using Facebook in Europe, only 34% of the web in Europe is using Facebook. So a guy like me, who's representing distribution of software across the web, has to look at numbers like this and figure out, is a social media strategy on Facebook the best way to get our product out there? There's some great points made in some of these other presentations, the first presentation that I was talking about is continual narcissism of corporations. So that's one point. But the other thing is, how relevant is stuff like Facebook? So we've seen these massive, massive numbers of Facebook, and it's so easy to talk about your Facebook strategy or whatever it is. But do people know that Facebook is banned in Vietnam, China, no relevance in Japan? If you want your content to go global, you have to think about how you're going to get it beyond things like just Twitter and Facebook. So anyway, these are a lot of the things that I look at, and I have to sell to our strategic managers because our marketing team will so easily gravitate toward, let's make a Facebook page. You know, great. Well, you need to talk about it. Like, the Facebook page to our community of volunteers in China, not only will they not participate, they don't know what it is. You know, this is really, really relevant stuff to talk about. So anyway, the world average Facebook index is, as we know, 26% of the world is using Facebook. So I don't want to slam it too much because, of course, it is being used. So let's talk about the Mozilla localization community. And let me just do a quick check on time. Okay, we'll get ourselves done by 1 o'clock to be on the lunchtime schedule. Okay, so this graphic, if you can't read it, this represents, we did this really interesting campaign that we localized for the distribution of Firefox 3 back in 2008. And what we did is called Download Day. And we took aim at a non-existent world record and we set it. So great, Guinness Book of World Records came in and was like, wow, awesome, you guys set the rules for the world record, then you set it. I guess we have to give you something. Anyway, Download Day, the most downloads in one day of any application. Okay, so we had over 28 million downloads of Firefox 3 the day we launched. Now, the first thing about that is you're not going to get 28 million downloads unless you have a global strategy and content that's localized for the world to consume. But the second thing about that is we tracked where those downloads came from. So red, as a heat map, shows lots of downloads, and the other colors represent less downloads. So I'm putting this question out here to you guys. I looked at this map as the director of localization for this whole sort of global distribution of Firefox. I looked at this map on the day we launched Firefox 3, and what am I thinking? Does anyone have a guess? What can I use this map for from a strategic standpoint to try to sort of determine what we need to do? Yeah, in the corner.
Looking at where the growth opportunity is.
Yeah, where the growth opportunity is. And is there any more specificity to add to that? Yeah, in the back, please.
I suppose leveraging
What I'm going to do. Yeah, like what's the opportunity? Where's the growth opportunity, and what am I going to do? And what I looked at here is I saw there were countries that were bright red that we didn't have localizations for. So Thailand, for instance, and some of these countries in Southeast Asia, some of the countries in Central Asia. And I thought to myself, we have no localized content, we have no localization of our products there. We're only localized in 46, 48 languages at this point. Why are we not here? There's a massive, massive user base. We can only get stronger if we localize our content there. So a lot of people thought that this was a gimmick, like, hey, Firefox did this download day, and I looked at it and said, wow, this is an amazing map of where our users are. So, I don't know, maybe you guys have something like that as well, but any points of data that you think you can use to get sort of indication of where users might come from and where a content strategy, localized content strategy might help you is I think, a helpful thing. Oh. Okay, so what we did is we then localized. And we now have, for Firefox 4, we'll have over 80 localizations. So from Firefox 3 to Firefox 4, which doesn't represent just one version. We have 3.5 and 3.6. But over that 2 to 3 year period, we've doubled in size. And our goal, we don't really have an end goal here. It's not like, hey, if we hit 100, we stop. It's just, let's let anybody who wants to participate in the open source world localize our product. And that's 100% volunteer driven. And this is really the critical point. So we have global content being distributed across the world, and it's done by volunteers. So we don't pay a dime for localization except for my salary and the team of engineers that I manage, which is 4 of us. So we have 450 million users, and over 60% of our user base is using a localized user interface. And over 75% of our users are coming from outside the United States. And our premier, or sort of our starting point localization is the ENUS code base. So anyway, to have this volunteer-driven product and distribution strategy is amazingly leveraged. And I don't know what the opportunities for you guys are to have an open source community participate to help localize things, but it's obviously a very powerful thing to be able to distribute this content across the world. And those localized versions, by our calculations, and we use a lot of the Internet World Stats, give over 97% of the world's internet population a user interface in their own language. So if you want to browse the web in Scots Gaelic, you can do that. At least the user interface of Firefox will be translated into that, or whatever the obscure language might be that we have passionate community members translating, and we've enabled them to do. So onto our websites. I am also responsible for translating and customizing and localizing all the content on our websites. So if you take a look at Mozilla.com, which is a top 20 website in the world, 32% of our visitors are coming from the US, and 68% are coming from the rest of the world. This graph with these beautiful retro styled colors is not just some sort of like kind of kaleidoscope of colors. Actually, each of those wedges does represent a country that's asking is visiting us from Mozilla.com. So we have on a monthly basis over 19 million unique visits to Mozilla.com. Our add-ons website, 18% in the United States, 82% across the world. So we have over 18 million monthly unique visitors to add-ons.mozilla.org. And add-ons, by the way, are the small snippets of code that you can add to your browser to sort of customize your browsing experience. If there are Firefox users in the room, you probably have experimented a little bit with add-ons. So. And then Mozilla Europe, which is another site that we use to help distribute specifically to the European context. You can see where we have 17% are coming from Germany. There's over 6 million unique visitors a month to Mozilla Europe. But of course, all of this content is localized. So a global view of Mozilla's websites. You have page views on the left in the blue, visits in the light green. So you can see on a monthly basis, you have some pretty amazing numbers. There's a lot of page views happening after visitors come. Add-ons, Mozilla.org has a very, very attentive audience. People who come there want to be there, and they end up spending some time there. This is not new visitors per day. This is new visitors per month. So sorry about that. And then average visitors per day. So Mozilla.com is getting almost 700,000 visits a day. So we have this massive download rate still happening every day, over hundreds of thousands of downloads happening. And this is probably one that we spend just a little more time on. So I localize, these are the 3 primary sites that I'm responsible for localizing. And the lowest one is AMO, which probably has 35 different localizations right now. And the people who hit AMO are viewing nearly 3 different pages when they come there. But as always, the bounce rate is always a critical thing to take a look at. So add-ons, people want to come there. They're bouncing out of there only 30% of the time. The remaining time they're there, and they're spending on average 5, almost 6 minutes on the site, clicking through, trying to find out what they're looking for. So if we don't have good localized content on that site, I don't think that those stats would be that strong, if they even are that strong compared to other sites. But I think they're pretty strong. The one that worries me is Mozilla Europe. Like, why is there a bounce rate of over 80%? And why are we spending time localizing it? What's the deal? So we really need to focus on that. And there's a lot of legacy passion around Mozilla Europe. When we were just a nonprofit, well, we are a nonprofit organization, but when we were just starting out, we had just anybody out there that could help us get Mozilla source code out there, and Mozilla Europe took shape. We're really responsible for a lot of the growth that happened in Europe in the early days. But as we've started to coalesce as this global project, Mozilla Europe is having more and more trouble of like, well, what do they offer that's so different from Mozilla.com? And are people just searching for Mozilla and getting the site and clicking on it? And this bounce rate is really high. So we're going through a lot of internal discussions about, should we just put it all into one? Make it Mozilla.org. That's the site worldwide. And you'll probably see that coming up. Get rid of the .com, get rid of this hyphen Europe. Mozilla.org, you go there anywhere across the world and you get localized content. So how do we do Mozilla L10N? It's not perfect, so I'll stop anyone thinking that it is perfect. We have scale, we have this global community, but it's still loaded with some troubles. There's a higher barrier to entry to most projects. And I don't actually think that this is a bad thing. If you get the right people and they get over that barrier, they'll stick with you as volunteers because they made it. The challenge is, don't do things that are just frustrating to those who are willing to try to climb that barrier. So if the process is technical and it's complex, that's fine, because there are geeks out there who would love to learn this process. But they're geeks, and if you're doing something stupid, they will hammer you and go away and go localize for Chrome or whatever. So like the idea is, if you're going to build an open source community, you should really, not worry as much about complexity, but definitely make the process smart. So in 3.5, we had 48 localizations right at the launch. In 4, we'll have close to 85 localizations. And as I said, that covers about 97% of the world's internet population in the user's native language option. So how do we accomplish this? I could spend a lot of time on this slide. Formatting is a little bit different, but I've split it into 2 sections. So what you see on your right, it says engage. That should be over this section. And empower should be over this section. And I always try to start with engaging people. So if we're engaging users, engaging possible volunteers, what exactly does that mean? You have to create an opportunity for them to participate. If you haven't done that, then you're not going to get anyone doing something cool for you for free as part of a great community. You need to explicitly outline those tasks for them to do if they're going to engage with you, and make deadlines. So we release software. There's no mistake about it. You're part of the release cycle. You're part of the release team. You have to be in by this date. And be very strict about it. If someone doesn't get in, then they have to get in the next time. But if you're wishy-washy about it, I do think that creates too much flexibility, and you'll lose volunteers. And then empowerment is sort of the next thing. So you've got someone engaged. Okay, I want to do this. This is what I want to do. Okay, I can meet these timelines. But what does it mean to empower them? It means handing the keys over to them, really. And when we have localizers in the Mozilla community, these are people who actually are the local content strategists for us. If a localizer from China comes to me and says, this is how the web works in China, you need to allow me to customize these websites to be able to present a more meaningful message to users here, done. We have enough trust with these volunteers that they can do that, and we make that possible. There's full transparency, and there's a clearly defined role. When these people come in and say, look, this is you, you're the module owner of this, do what you need to do with it, let us know how we can make that content relevant in your local market. And communication is critical. We need to be online. My team is online 24 hours a day, really, interacting with volunteers. So that's a bit of a high-stress position, but it's worth it. We're getting this massive community of people doing something that we think is great for the web. So there are tons of tools there. It's probably a conversation for offline, but if you're interested, I can take you through those. And then just basic tools. What do you need to do to get a volunteer community? You need to have some sort of dashboard, right? Show these people progress. Show them what they need to do, how much more they have to go, and when they're green. And then they can ship. You need to have translation tools. We have a thing called Naro and Verbatim. You need to be able to test. And you need to basically allow people to give them local community management. How can they set up their communities? This is live documentation. You guys, when I send this out, click on these links, take a look at all the documentation we have out there for people to follow and figure out how to do Mozilla. And here's Naro. So there's a guy from Romania, part of our community, lead Romanian localizer, who also happens to be a gifted software developer. And he said, Seth, I'm going to launch this tool that is a slick web interface that should make localization of your websites and products easier. So sure, I can't stop him. Go for it. Well, it turns out it's a pretty cool tool. So inside, you hit the URL, you get this main page. It shows you all your projects, and it gives you the opportunity to manage the project. So let's say you click through on Firefox. Now you see strings. Okay, I can translate those strings. What does this mean? Like, the connection is untrusted. We've seen that come up before when we're browsing the web. You hit some sort of strange website, this connection is untrusted. Well, translate that into Romanian, please, or any of the other 85 languages. languages. So let's do a specific example. You guys have seen this page, right? Firefox, drop down the search engines that you can use, you can switch. But look at that thing at the bottom there, manage search engines. That's a string inside Firefox. That's what these guys are translating, okay? So they get the user interface. There may not be a brand translation for Google. In fact, Google may tell us, do not translate the name Google. But manage search engines, you can translate. So you go and you search for manage search engines inside Naro, and bam, there it is. So enter your translated text. Pretty easy. Anyone can participate. There's a locale owner on Naro who can approve anyone's suggestions. If you guys speak a second language and you want to suggest something, go find Naro and suggest it. Then you can test it. You get all those strings that have been approved. You can click export. You get yourself a nice little add-on to your browser. You start that thing again, and bam, there's your translated user interface. And for that manage search engines things that I just showed you, you click on that arrow in the top right there, and there would be your translation. One of the first pieces of UI that you can see translated, and you've just hooked a volunteer. And they go, damn, that was easy. I can actually do this, you know? What else is there to do? And lo and behold, there's 4,000 strings that you can spend 6 months translating, and you've been declared the lead localizer for Firefox. And when you're done with that, you can go to Mozilla.com and you can do the same thing. You can go to add-ons, you can go to Mozilla Europe, you can go to Thunderbird, our email client, you can go to any of these things out there and you can translate. But you're not just a translator, you're a localizer, right? So as a localizer, how do we keep these people really passionate about what they do? You did it once, great, I don't care, I'm so sick of you guys. You bother me every 6 months to update these strings. Well, let's make these people really hooked. And let's be transparent. Let's create some weekly reports. So every week, I worked with our statistics team to create weekly reports to our localizers. And you can see that I show, for instance, our Chinese localizer every week, the number of people who are using his version of Firefox. 4.0 coming, so there are 2 people using it. But 3.6 has almost 1 million average daily users. Now that number doesn't represent the number of Chinese users. That represents the number of times an individual application asks for an update on a daily basis. But as it turns out, people on the web don't use their Firefox browser every single day. They use it roughly every other day, maybe every 3 days. So the rough multiplier for this that we've gotten from sources like CNN.com is 3. They get about, from their user agent tracking, they've told us that if they get this number, it represents about a factor of 3 of how many users are out there. So you take that number, and there are 3 million people using the translated version of Chinese on the present version of the browser. The upcoming release, it'll quickly shift over, and they'll get 1 million users or more, obviously growing. We saw the growth patterns happening. And then there's still legacy versions, Firefox 3.5. There's still people out there using that. Then we show them the top localizations in China. So Chinese is big, ENUS is big, Korean, Chinese Taiwan. That's an important one because that's simplified versus traditional Chinese. And it's pretty important if you're doing a presentation in Taiwan not to use simplified Chinese or you will be asked to leave the country. So this is localization, right? Downloads. How many people are downloading this thing? 15,000 downloads of Firefox 4, 2 users. So people have downloaded it, they're not using it yet. And then other countries that are using your locale. So, or I'm sorry, other locales in your country, I showed you that. And then other countries using your locale. So China is the #1 place, but in the US, there are 37,000 people using it. Malaysia. That's pretty cool. You know, you start to get a sense of where is the Chinese diaspora. And we can find out these amazing things we find out about just sort of general sociological things because of our localization program. So why not just use machine translation? The answer is pretty simple. Don't use it. You know, there's this string inside Firefox, and you can look at Basque and Romansh. These are some of these smaller niche languages. There's no machine translation offered, let alone some of the ridiculous things that you get from machine translation. So, in summary, lessons learned. If you're scaling a community, focus on empowering these people and transparent communication, full transparency, good tools. It can be as complex as you want, but don't do stupid stuff. Make the barriers low. They can still be there. There can still be a barrier entry, but make it low enough that people can get over it. Fix your imperfections in your system really early, as early as possible before you become too entrenched. It's really hard to fix problems after the fact because people just do it that way. And they get attached to it, and then it's part of them, and then they get pissed because you want to change it. If you know it's a problem, fix it early. And if your team is creating content, just always, always, always ask that team, is it intended for a global audience? And if you're trying to convince people that it should be, lead with that question. Go to your steering committee, go to your strategy team and say, do you want this to be global? Do you want your product to reach the rest of the globe? Let's figure out a localization strategy. And it's really hard for a strategic manager to answer no to that question, because that's revenue. So anyone can start contributing. These are the massive amounts of ways. 85% of our users hear about Mozilla through word of mouth. That's an amazing number. We don't spend a lot on advertising. Our global annual marketing budget last year was $4 million. The amount of money that Internet Explorer spent to market the release of IE7 was $100 million for one product launch. Our global marketing budget is $4 million or less. That was a couple years. It's gone up this past year, but we focus on what works, and word of mouth has worked for us. So in Firefox 1.0, our community came together and took out a two-page, full-page ad in New York Times. We didn't raise that money. We didn't spend all that money. They did. We were going to try to raise $100,000 to get a small square, and they raised, I think it might have been $250,000 or maybe $1 million, and they took out a two-page ad in New York Times. Firefox 2, we saw some really cool global things. Firefox 3, even the aliens preferred it. And let's see what happens for Firefox 4. So that's me, and I'll open it up to any questions you may have. We have about 5 minutes, and then I guess it's lunchtime. Yes, in front here, please.
Going back to that download day graphic.
Let's get there. Okay, yeah, your question?
So, talking about the download day graphic, you say that you were seeing high levels of downloads in countries where there wasn't any localization, and you saw that as an opportunity to localize. There's a counter-argument that you saw 500,000 downloads without the localization.
Yeah.
So, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, you got downloads, why would you invest more resources in putting more there? My assumption, and it may have been incorrect, but it turned out that it wasn't, was that if there are people getting it in English, then we can only benefit by offering it localized. And now, that was an assumption, and there was a bit of a risk that we took. Not a big risk, because localization at Mozilla is volunteer driven. We knew we had localizers there who wanted to do it, so that the incremental cost for us adding that was not big. So if it's a strategic decision that you're looking at, yeah, maybe that's a good thing. You may not invest resources to do that. In our case, I made the assumption, and it turns out the day that we launched the Thai version later on for Firefox, 3.3 or something, the downloads spiked. We got a massive amount of downloads. The craving for local content in Thailand was huge. It happened in Mexico as well. 20,000 downloads a day from day one, and only growing, and content viewed. So it wasn't that people didn't want English or that they were dissatisfied with English. I'm sure it was serviceable, but I think they were excited that we came, and it made it better. We got more brand awareness and more strength, I think, by doing that. Other question? Yeah, let's go here and then in the back. Your question in the front? I can repeat the question too.
I just want to go back to a comment that you made earlier about the web that hasn't penetrated Africa and how you can quantify that in what research you did.
The research that I do is somewhat subjective and somewhat objective. So can you do subjective research? I don't know, but we have volunteers in Africa who want to localize and participate, and they give us information about where the strong points of the African web are. So there's a lot of web activity in South Africa, a lot in Kenya, a lot in West Africa. So we'll be launching Firefox 4 with probably 5 to 10 African-based languages, maybe close to 15, which is way more than any other browser company does. It's just not a strategic interest to a place like Google. They could care less because they don't get any revenue from having localized content in Wolof. But the other stuff that I look at is the Internet World Stats, and I try to assess where they see things like growth coming. So that combination of talking to people on the ground in these various localizations who are gifted technologists who know, they're leading researchers at local universities, and they're telling me, coupled with stuff I find on the Internet World Stats, helps me just say, hey, look. But first and foremost, beyond doing any research to try to make a quantifiable decision at Mozilla, we need to make sure those who are engaged and empowered can participate. So if an African-based localization comes to me and wants to participate, let's do it. In the back?
My question was basically, how do you motivate those volunteers? I mean, just national pride because they want to see their side of their country.
Yeah.
Or is the sort of like nicely body?
So motivations, how do we motivate these localizers? And perhaps this will be the last question. The first thing, you mentioned national pride. In fact, I steer clear from national pride. And if you're getting localized to the extent that Mozilla is, do not associate flags with anything. Because those are Kurdish localizers, or, I know, I'll get to it, but what I'm just saying, trying to, yeah. Yes, okay, so I'm sorry for that, Raquel, I'll pull myself out. But yeah, so how do we motivate people? I think the big motivation for people is this mixture between technology, cool, leading edge, cutting edge, modern technology, modern browser technology with culture, blending that. So that people, from what I've learned inside this sort of subculture, people are deeply passionate about technology. Geeks are everywhere. And you don't need a lot of geeks to do a lot. But also, people are deeply passionate about their languages and their culture and where they come from. So inside Spain, for instance, this is a quick anecdote, but I could reference, if you guys want this, I will, anybody who contacts me on Twitter, I'll tweet this really amazing bug. Actually, I may not, might stir the flames again, but there was this debate between the Catalan localizers and the Valencian wannabe localizers. So Catalan is a language spoken in Catalonia, Barcelona, Spain, and deeply passionate. I think every 10 years, that community of people goes so far as to even, considering seceding from Spain. There are these very realistic movements. And these guys from Valencia wanted to localize Firefox into Valencian, and they filed a bug, and the Catalan localizers came in and started this 6-month debate that got so ugly, talking about Valencian being slang version of Catalan. This is not the language. And I had to go in and play Kofi Annan at the time to try to be this, intermediator. And made some mistakes and tried to recover and did some other stuff. But I mean, there was ugly stuff happening. There was people saying that the Valencians were fascists because they associated with a language studies program that had some weird time. It got so ugly. But the lesson to me was that if people are passionate enough to debate these things about languages, this thing will spread. Just make it available. So what was our solution to that? Catalan is an officially shipped version of Firefox, so you can download that binary from our website. Valencian, we made an add-on. And we said, look, prove to us that this has a massive market appeal. Let's start with an add-on. And if you guys get a massive number of people using Valencian, then we can say we'll offer it as a fully official version. And luckily, the Catalan, well, they weren't happy with that. They accepted it. Okay, maybe that's it. So if you have any other questions, I'll be around all day today and perhaps tomorrow as well. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Seth.